My family ignored me for 15 years. Not one call on my birthday. Not one visit on Christmas morning. Then one quiet Tuesday, my son suddenly remembered I existed because he needed my signature. The first thing I noticed when Daniel and his wife sat across from me was how carefully polite they were. People who truly love you don't rehearse their kindness. But people who want something from you often do. We were sitting in a small conference room on the second floor of a law office downtown, the kind with beige walls, a humming air conditioner, and a view of a parking lot full of sedans baking under the late summer sun. Daniel kept adjusting his watch, glancing at the folder in front of me, then back at my face like he was waiting for a moment that refused to arrive. Vanessa sat beside him with a smile so gentle it almost looked sincere. Almost. 15 years earlier that same woman had slowly erased me from my own family's life. Invitations stopped coming. Holidays became quiet. Phone calls went unanswered. At first I thought it was busy schedules. Young families have a way of running on their own gravity. Then months became years. And eventually silence became routine. I stopped setting an extra place at the table. I stopped expecting my phone to ring on Sunday afternoons. The strange thing about being ignored long enough is that the pain doesn't stay sharp. It dulls. It settles into something quieter, something colder. Like living in a house where one room has been locked for so long you forget what used to be inside it. That's the room Daniel closed when he married Vanessa. I remember the day clearly. She was charming, organized, the kind of woman who spoke gently but moved people around like furniture in a room. At first I admired her confidence. Then slowly, almost invisibly, I became an inconvenience. First it was holiday schedules that didn't quite work for me. Then birthday dinners that had already happened by the time I heard about them. Then school events for my grandchildren that were too crowded for extra guests. Each explanation sounded reasonable by itself. Together they built a wall 15 years high. I didn't fight it. I didn't beg for attention. Pride has a way of protecting what dignity it can. I built a quieter life instead. I planted tomatoes in the backyard every spring. I took long walks through the neighborhood park where the same maple trees turned gold every October. I learned how peaceful a Sunday afternoon could be when it belonged entirely to you. That's why when Daniel called me 2 weeks ago, his voice warm in a way I hadn't heard since he was young, I knew immediately something had changed. Mom, he said, like the word had just returned to his vocabulary. We need your help with something small. Just some paperwork. It won't take long. Paperwork. Such an innocent word. But innocent words rarely travel alone. I asked him what kind of paperwork. There was a pause. Just half a second, but long enough for a mother to hear the truth hiding behind it. Just a form, he said. It requires your signature. Now here we were in that quiet office, a legal folder resting in front of me like it weighed more than paper should. Daniel leaned forward slightly, hopeful. Vanessa folded her hands neatly on the table. I looked at both of them carefully, the way you look at strangers whose faces feel familiar but whose intentions you don't quite trust. After 15 years of silence, my family had suddenly found me again. Not because they missed me. Because they needed something that still had my name on it. The room stayed quiet for a moment after Daniel finished speaking, the kind of quiet that feels carefully arranged rather than natural. I rested my hands on the edge of the table and looked down at the folder without opening it yet. Paper has a strange weight when everyone in the room is waiting for you to touch it. Daniel cleared his throat softly, the same nervous habit he had when he was 12 years old and trying to explain why a baseball had gone through the neighbor's window. Some things never change, even when everything else does. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her smile warm and patient, like someone waiting for a shy child to make the right decision. 15 years ago she had that same smile the first time she walked into my house for dinner. She brought a cherry pie she said she baked herself and complimented the yellow curtains in my kitchen. I remember how proud Daniel looked sitting beside her at the table. Back then I believed my family was simply growing larger. I did not realize it was quietly rearranging itself without me in the center anymore. It did not happen overnight. The first Christmas after their wedding was the beginning. Daniel called and said they were splitting the holiday between families that year. It sounded fair. The next year there was a ski trip with friends. The year after that there was a new baby and a schedule that was too busy for travel. Each year came with a polite explanation. Each explanation sounded reasonable enough that I told myself not to be difficult. Mothers are very good at stepping aside for the happiness of their children. What I did not see at the time was the pattern forming behind those explanations. Phone calls grew shorter. Visits became rare. Then they stopped entirely. I remember one Sunday afternoon about 8 years ago when I drove past Daniel's old neighborhood on the way home from the grocery store. The house was different by then, freshly painted with a new white fence. I slowed down for just a moment and wondered what my grandchildren looked like now. I had not seen them since they were small enough to hold in one arm. It is a strange feeling to realize that people who share your blood are living entire lives just a few miles away while you exist outside the frame of their photographs. Eventually I stopped wondering. Life has a way of filling empty spaces if you allow it to. I joined a small gardening club at the community center. I learned which mornings the park trails were quietest for walking. My world became smaller, but it also became calmer. That is why Daniel's phone call 2 weeks ago sounded so out of place in the rhythm of my life. His voice was cheerful, almost eager. Vanessa even spoke briefly in the background, asking about my health and saying they had missed me. Those words felt unfamiliar after so many years of silence. Now, sitting across from them in that office, I could see the same careful politeness in their expressions. It was not affection. It was anticipation. I finally opened the folder and glanced at the first page. Legal language covered the paper in tight paragraphs, the kind designed to look simple while hiding something important between the lines. Daniel leaned forward immediately when he saw the page turn, his eyes bright with expectation. Vanessa's smile widened just a little more. I did not say anything. Instead I slowly turned the page, letting the quiet stretch a little longer, because after 15 years of silence I had learned something valuable about patience. When people need something badly enough, they always reveal more than they intend to. I let the second page rest in front of me for a moment without reading it aloud. The silence in the room had a different shape now. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and Vanessa's fingers tightened together on the table like she was holding something invisible in place. I had spent most of my life learning how to listen to what people say, but the older I became, the more valuable another skill turned out to be. Watching what people do while they are waiting. Daniel was never good at hiding impatience. Even as a child he would tap his foot during long church services or fidget with the salt shaker during dinner if dessert was taking too long. Now that same restless energy was sitting right across from me, only dressed in a business shirt and a careful smile. "It is nothing complicated," he said after a moment, his voice gentle in a way that sounded practiced. "Just a property transfer form. The lawyer said we only need your approval to finalize everything." Approval. Another harmless-sounding word. I nodded slowly but did not reach for the pen resting beside the folder. Instead, I let my eyes move across the lines of legal text. The words were arranged the way legal language always is, calm and tidy on the surface, but heavy underneath. Transfer of ownership. Authorization of sale. Final consent of surviving spouse. That last phrase caught my attention the way a small stone catches the sole of your shoe when you are walking. I read the sentence again, slower this time. Surviving spouse. Daniel watched my face carefully, trying to read what I had noticed. Vanessa leaned a little closer toward him and whispered something I could not hear, though the tone carried a quiet urgency. I remembered another conversation many years earlier, long before the silence between us began. My husband Richard and I had been sitting at the kitchen table late one evening while the dishwasher hummed softly in the background. He was going through paperwork from his business, explaining which documents mattered and which ones were routine. I had teased him for being overly careful, telling him I trusted Daniel to handle things one day. Richard smiled in that patient way he had and said something I did not fully understand at the time. He told me that trust was important, but protection was wiser. Some signatures carry more weight than people realize, he said. At the time it sounded like the kind of practical advice husbands give when they think too far ahead about the future. Now those words returned to me with surprising clarity as I sat in that quiet office. Daniel cleared his throat again. "Mom, the buyers are waiting for confirmation," he said. Buyers. That word had not appeared anywhere in the explanation he gave on the phone. I closed the folder gently and placed both hands on top of it. Daniel's eyes flickered down to the paper and then back to my face, the hopeful look beginning to crack at the edges. Vanessa's smile did not disappear, but it stiffened slightly, like a photograph that had been left too long in the sun. 15 years of distance had taught me many things, but one lesson stood above the rest. When people suddenly become kind after a long silence, it is rarely because their hearts have changed. It is because something they want is standing right in front of them, holding a pen. I kept my hands resting on the closed folder and looked at Daniel for a long moment without speaking. Silence has a way of making people reveal more than questions ever do. He shifted in his chair again, then leaned forward with that same careful tone he had been using since we arrived. "It is just a formality," he said. "The house on Lake Briar was part of Dad's old business holdings, and the buyers are ready to close next week. The lawyer said everything is already arranged. We only need your approval so the transfer can be completed." Lake Briar. Hearing that name felt like opening a window to a memory that had been sealed for years. Richard used to take me there on quiet Sunday mornings long before Daniel was grown. It was not a large property, just a modest 2-story house with cedar siding and a narrow wooden dock that stretched about 20 feet into the water. In the fall the trees around the lake turned the deepest shades of red and gold, and the reflection on the water made the whole shoreline look like a painting. Richard loved that place because it was peaceful, far away from the noise of the city and the endless meetings his business required. I remember one evening there clearly. The sun had just disappeared behind the trees, and we were sitting on the dock with 2 cups of coffee while the water stayed perfectly still. Richard had been unusually thoughtful that night, turning a small brass key over in his fingers as if it carried more meaning than its size suggested. "One day this place will matter more than it does now," he said quietly. I laughed at the time and told him it was just a lake house. He shook his head slightly and said something that seemed odd then but made perfect sense now. Some things are never meant to be rushed into the wrong hands. At the time I thought he was simply talking about patience, the way he often did when business deals became complicated. Now, sitting across from Daniel and Vanessa, those words returned with a weight that settled slowly into place. Vanessa was the one who spoke next, her voice warm and smooth like someone explaining a simple favor. "It really is straightforward," she said. "The property has appreciated a lot over the years. The buyers are offering a very generous price, and Daniel has already handled all the details. This signature just confirms the final step." I nodded slowly while listening to her explanation, though my attention was no longer on the words themselves. It was on the small things surrounding them. The way Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on the folder in front of me instead of meeting mine. The way Vanessa's smile appeared every time the conversation drifted too close to specifics. And most of all the way both of them avoided mentioning one simple detail. Neither of them had explained why a house purchased by my husband decades ago still required my consent after all these years. I opened the folder again and let my eyes move slowly across the page as if I were simply reviewing what they had already described. Daniel watched every movement carefully. Vanessa remained perfectly still beside him. The air conditioner hummed quietly above us, pushing cool air into the room while the afternoon sunlight pressed against the window behind them. I reached the final page and paused where the signature line waited. The pen rested just inches away from my hand. Daniel leaned forward again, hopeful and tense at the same time. Vanessa's smile returned, gentle and patient. I studied the blank line for another moment before lifting my eyes back to them. 15 years ago they stopped needing me. Today, suddenly, they could not move forward without me. Daniel watched my hand resting near the pen as if the distance between my fingers and that signature line was the only thing standing between him and something he had already decided belonged to him. Vanessa remained composed beside him, but the patience in her smile had begun to thin around the edges. People who are waiting for good news often look relaxed. People who are waiting for control look tense even when they try not to. I turned the final page slowly and read the closing paragraph again, not because the language was difficult, but because sometimes the most important truth hides in the smallest sentence. Transfer of ownership would be finalized immediately upon authorization of the surviving spouse. That phrase appeared again, this time impossible to ignore. Surviving spouse. I glanced up at Daniel. Your father bought that property long before your business ventures began, I said calmly. My voice sounded steady even to my own ears. Why would my approval still be required after all these years if the house was already part of your holdings? Daniel hesitated just long enough for the question to settle into the room. Vanessa answered first, her tone smooth and reassuring. It is simply an old clause in the paperwork, she said. Properties tied to Richard's earlier investments sometimes require confirmation from the family estate. It is really just a technicality. Technicality. That was the third harmless word I had heard since sitting down at this table. Form. Approval. Technicality. Words designed to sound light enough to pass without question. But Richard had never been careless with details, especially not when it came to business. He used to say that contracts were stories written in a language only patients could understand. I remembered the day he finalized the purchase of that lake house. Daniel had been in college at the time, full of ideas about starting companies and expanding faster than caution would allow. Richard supported his ambition, but he also understood something about the future that Daniel did not yet appreciate. Protection was not about mistrust. It was about time revealing who people truly became. I ran my finger slowly across the edge of the paper while thinking about that evening on the dock again. The small brass key Richard held had opened a locked cabinet inside the lake house study. Inside that cabinet were folders he said were meant to stay untouched unless something unusual ever happened in the family. At the time I thought it sounded overly dramatic. Now, listening to Vanessa carefully explain how simple everything was supposed to be, I began to understand exactly why Richard had spoken that way. Daniel leaned forward again, trying to keep his voice relaxed. Mom, the closing is scheduled for Friday morning, he said. The buyers are ready, the bank is ready, everyone is waiting. Once you sign, everything will be finalized and the funds will be transferred immediately. Funds. That word landed heavier than the others. It was the first honest piece of information anyone had offered since we sat down. I closed the folder gently and rested both palms on top of it again. The pen still waited beside the paper, untouched. Daniel's eyes followed the movement with quiet urgency. Vanessa's smile returned once more, calm and encouraging, the way someone looks at a door they expect to open at any moment. I met their eyes one at a time before speaking again. Your father used to tell me something about signatures, I said slowly. He said the right one could move a fortune. And the wrong one could protect it. The room grew very still after that. Daniel did not smile this time. The hopeful expression he had been holding onto since we sat down slowly faded, replaced by something more serious. Vanessa remained composed, but the quiet confidence in her posture had shifted slightly, the way it does when a conversation begins moving in a direction someone did not expect. I could see both of them trying to decide whether I understood more than they wanted me to. The truth was that I did not yet know everything. But I knew enough. And sometimes enough is exactly what patience is. Waiting for. I opened the folder again, turning the pages slowly as if I were simply reviewing details that required careful attention. The paper rustled softly each time I moved a page, and that small sound seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet room. Daniel watched every movement. Vanessa leaned closer, her voice calm and encouraging. "If there is anything you want us to explain, we are happy to go over it," she said gently. I nodded once, still reading. "I believe I understand most of it," I replied. "But I would like to be certain." That answer seemed to relax Daniel slightly. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms in a way that suggested the conversation was finally moving toward the ending he had expected from the beginning. For a moment I let the silence settle again while my eyes moved across the last page. The numbers were written clearly near the bottom of the document. Purchase price. Transfer authorization. Financial settlement upon closing. Even without a calculator, it was obvious that the property had grown far beyond the modest value Richard paid for it years ago. Lakefront land has a way of doing that when cities expand and quiet places become desirable. I thought about the narrow dock again and the calm water that used to reflect the autumn trees like glass. Daniel spoke after another moment, his voice lighter now. "It is a good deal," he said. "The buyers are offering far more than we expected. Once everything is finalized, it will give us a lot of flexibility with future investments." Us. That word slipped naturally into his explanation. It sounded like the language of partnership. But partnerships usually involve conversations long before the final signature is requested. I placed the folder back on the table and looked directly at him. "Daniel," I said slowly, "when was the last time you visited that house?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He hesitated before answering. "It has been a while," he admitted. "The place has mostly been used as an asset rather than a residence." Asset. Another interesting choice of words. Richard never spoke about that house that way. To him it was quiet, reflection, time away from noise. I rested my hand lightly on the closed folder again. The pen still waited beside it, exactly where it had been since the beginning of this meeting. Vanessa watched me carefully now, her smile returning but thinner than before. Daniel leaned forward again, the patience in his posture slowly dissolving into urgency. They had spent 15 years building a life that did not include me. But today, everything they wanted to finish depended on the same person they had once found so easy to leave behind. And the more they tried to guide my hand toward that signature line, the clearer one simple truth became. Richard had not designed those papers to move quickly. He had designed them to wait for the moment when someone would try. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I leaned back slightly in my chair and let the quiet stretch across the table again. The air conditioner hummed steadily above us, pushing cool air through the room, but I could still feel the warmth of the late afternoon sun pressing against the window behind Daniel and Vanessa. Daniel finally exhaled slowly, the patience he had been trying to maintain beginning to slip. "Mom," he said carefully, "the closing is scheduled in 3 days. The buyers are already arranging financing. We really need to finalize this today so everything stays on track." I nodded as if I understood the urgency, which in a way I did. When people build a plan that depends on a single step, they become very nervous when that step does not happen exactly on time. Vanessa leaned forward again, folding her hands neatly on the table. "This is a wonderful opportunity," she added softly. "The market around Lake Briar has grown tremendously. It would be a shame to lose such a generous offer." I studied both of them for a moment before answering. The strange thing about sitting quietly for long enough is that people begin to talk more than they planned to. They fill the silence with explanations, and those explanations slowly reveal the parts they hoped would remain unnoticed. "When did you start arranging the sale?" I asked calmly. Daniel hesitated again, but this time the pause was shorter. About 6 months ago, he admitted. The property has been sitting unused for years, so we thought it made sense to move forward. 6 months. That meant meetings, contracts, negotiations, and plans that had been carefully prepared long before my phone ever rang. I glanced down at the folder again, running my finger lightly along the edge of the final page. And during those 6 months, I said quietly, it never occurred to you that I might want to see the place again before it was sold. Daniel shifted in his seat. Vanessa's smile returned once more, though it looked more deliberate now. Of course you could visit any time, she said quickly. The sale is simply a financial decision. Financial decision. I thought again about the narrow wooden dock and the evenings Richard and I spent watching the water turn silver under the moonlight. To him that house was never just an asset waiting to be converted into numbers on a page. It was a quiet refuge he protected carefully, even when the rest of his life became complicated. I closed the folder once more and folded my hands on top of it. Daniel leaned forward immediately, the movement almost automatic now. He believed we were close to the moment he had been waiting for since the meeting began. Vanessa watched my face with careful attention, her eyes searching for the smallest signal that the conversation had finally reached its conclusion. I let another moment pass before speaking again. Your father used to keep records inside a cabinet in the study at that house, I said slowly. Business documents. Personal notes. Things he believed should only be opened at the right time. Daniel frowned slightly, clearly unsure why that detail mattered. Vanessa remained still, but the confidence in her expression dimmed just enough to notice. I remember that cabinet, I continued. It was locked with a small brass key. I paused then, allowing the memory to settle into the quiet room. Daniel glanced at Vanessa briefly before looking back at me. Neither of them said anything. They were both waiting for me to reach for the pen. Instead, I simply rested my hand on the closed folder again and looked directly at them. 15 years ago they stopped inviting me into their lives. Today they had invited me into a room where everything they wanted depended on what I chose to do next. Daniel stared at me for several seconds after I mentioned the cabinet. It was a small change in the conversation, but it shifted the air in the room the way a sudden breeze changes the surface of still water. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, studying my face with careful attention. A cabinet, she asked, her voice still smooth but no longer as relaxed as before. I nodded once. In the study at the lake house, I said. Richard kept important documents there. Business contracts, letters, and other records he believed might matter one day. Daniel leaned back slowly, crossing his arms again as if he was trying to evaluate whether that information had any real connection to the papers sitting on the table between us. I have been to that house many times, he said. I do not remember anything important being stored there. I looked at him calmly. That is because the cabinet stayed locked. For a moment neither of them spoke. Vanessa's smile faded just slightly before she recovered it again. Well, she said lightly, whatever was there probably became outdated years ago. The important thing now is the sale. Sale. The word sounded more impatient now. Daniel leaned forward again, tapping the table softly with one finger as if he were trying to guide the conversation back toward the signature waiting on the last page. Mom, the paperwork here has already been reviewed by the attorney handling the transaction, he said. Everything is completely legal. The buyers are simply waiting for the final authorization. Authorization. Another word that tried to make the decision sound small. I lifted the folder again and turned it toward the window so the afternoon light fell across the last page. The signature line remained empty, a thin black line that seemed almost too simple for the weight Daniel and Vanessa had placed on it. Your father never rushed decisions that involved the future, I said quietly. Daniel sighed, the sound soft but unmistakably frustrated. This is not complicated, he replied. The property has been unused for years. Selling it now is the practical choice. Practical. I closed the folder once more and rested it gently on the table. Practical choices are usually discussed with everyone involved, I said. Daniel did not answer immediately. Vanessa stepped in again, her voice calm but more direct than before. We understand this may feel sudden, she said. But the timing of the offer is excellent, and it benefits the family overall. Benefits the family. That phrase lingered in the air between us. I looked at them both for a long moment before speaking again. When Richard bought that property, he told me something. Very clearly, I said. He said that house would only change hands when the right person decided the time had come. Daniel's expression tightened slightly. And who exactly did he mean by the right person, he asked. I placed my hand gently on the folder again and met his eyes without raising my voice. The person whose name still appears on the final line of every document connected to that property. The room grew quiet again after that. Outside the window a car moved slowly across the parking lot, sunlight flashing briefly across its windshield before disappearing. Daniel glanced down at the pen once more. Vanessa watched me carefully, her expression now more cautious than confident. They had come into this meeting believing the outcome was already certain. But certainty has a way of dissolving when the one person holding the final decision stops following the path everyone expected. Daniel did not speak for several seconds after my last sentence. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said since the meeting began. Vanessa looked at him briefly, then back at me, her expression carefully controlled but no longer confident. For the first time since we sat down, neither of them seemed certain about what would happen next. I rested my hand lightly on the folder and looked down at the final page again. The thin signature line waited exactly where it had been all afternoon, quiet and patient. Daniel finally leaned forward again, though the calm certainty in his voice had faded. Mom, he said slowly, we have already come this far. The buyers are expecting the transfer. The entire arrangement is ready to move forward. Signing today would make everything simple. Simple. That word returned again, but it no longer sounded convincing. I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the table. The sound of the paper touching the wood seemed louder than it should have been. Daniel, I said quietly, when was the last time you asked how I was doing? The question seemed to surprise him more than anything else I had said. He blinked once, clearly unsure how to answer. Vanessa shifted slightly beside him, but she did not interrupt. I am serious, I continued calmly. Not about paperwork. Not about property. When was the last time you called just to ask if your mother was well? Daniel looked down at the table for a moment before answering. We have all been busy, he said finally. Life moves quickly. I nodded slowly. Yes, I replied. It certainly does. For 15 years life had moved quickly enough that I had slowly disappeared from their plans. Holidays passed without invitations. Birthdays arrived without phone calls. Entire seasons came and went without hearing Daniel's voice. At first I believed there must be some misunderstanding. Later I realized something much simpler had happened. They had built a life that did not require me anymore. I looked at the pen once more before gently sliding it a few inches farther away from the folder. Daniel noticed the movement immediately. Vanessa's smile faded completely now. Your father spent his entire life thinking about what would happen after he was gone, I said quietly. He trusted people, but he also prepared for the day when trust might be misplaced. Daniel looked up quickly. What are you saying? I met his eyes calmly. I am saying that Richard never designed those papers to be rushed through a meeting like this. The room remained perfectly still. Outside the window the afternoon sun had begun to sink lower, casting long shadows across the parking lot below. I rested both hands on the closed folder one last time before standing slowly from my chair. Daniel looked startled. Vanessa's eyes followed the movement carefully. I will visit the lake house tomorrow, I said simply. I want to see it again before any decisions are made. Daniel opened his mouth as if he wanted to argue, but no words came out. Vanessa remained silent. I looked at both of them for a moment before speaking again. Your father believed important choices should never be made in a hurry, I said calmly. Then I turned toward the door. For 15 years they had lived as if my presence no longer mattered. Now, suddenly, the one decision they needed most belonged entirely to me.